don't want to keep us waiting too long, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. We're going to be talking about responding to adolescent behavior. And this is part of our Nevada Juvenile Justice Institute, which is a series that I'll talk about more in a few minutes. But before we jump into that, because this is the first part of our Nevada Juvenile Justice Institute, I wanted to ask Judge Ian Walker, who is our lead judge on this project, to say a few words in welcome. So Judge Walker, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Can you hear me okay? Good afternoon. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very, very much for joining this, the first session of the Nevada Juvenile Justice Institute. I bring greetings to all of you from my co-chair, Joey Orduña Hastings, and want to give thanks first to the legislature for funding both the Juvenile Justice Oversight Commission to the extent that we receive funding through the legislature and funding this particular institute. I'd like to welcome you all to the institute and sort of give you a lay of the land, as it were. First, this is going to be in two parts. The first part is a series of 4 webinars today, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday over the lunch hour. The second part of the series is a collection of self-guided modules, each of which will take between 30 and 60 minutes. The 4 live sessions will be panel-based discussions designed to draw the audience into a conversation on responses to youth behavior, screening and assessment, judicial leadership and ethics, and engaging families. The self-guided sessions will cover topics like adolescent development, the history of the juvenile justice system, substance abuse, trauma, mental health, and many others. Each of the training modules, both live and self-guided, will be accompanied by 3 tools that will provide mechanisms for technology transfer. There's a note-taking guide with highlighted information on each topic, an implementation guide which will provide each of the participants with instructions for how to develop policies and procedures around the specific topic which is in focus, and then links to additional resources, including the NCJF-CJA publications and recorded webinars, as well as resources from other organizations like the ABA, the Center for Juvenile Justice, etc. Let's set the table for the discussion over the next 4 days in this way. First, the Nevada legislature, now 3 sessions ago, enabled the Nevada Juvenile Justice Commission. You all know that Joey and I were appointed co-chairs and are privileged to continue in that capacity. The Juvenile Justice Oversight Commission, through the work of its members really, certainly no credit is due to me, has covered a lot of ground in the last 2.5 years. That ground includes selecting assessments, both mental health assessments and risk and needs assessments, setting standards for those assessments for reporting across the state, and requiring the exchange of information between the commission, the legislature, the governor, and each jurisdiction. I always begin with a discussion about judicial education, with the exception of my friend Judge Voy, whom you'll hear from in a little bit. I received no education about juvenile justice until I was assigned to the juvenile justice caseload in Washoe County. That's critically important, I think, for all of you and for us as judges to understand. The specialized education I've received has all happened after my appointment as a juvenile justice judge. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we judges often learn on the job and from each other. And so this educational format is incredibly important. It's also important that folks who work with and around the courts understand the point of view of the courts, but more importantly, that the courts understand the point of view of the juvenile and family court system and all of the stakeholders in the juvenile and family court system. It's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce this topic and the Juvenile Justice Institute to all of you. I hope you find it informative and helpful in your practice. Jessica, thank you very much for the privilege of introduction. I return the forum to you.
Thank you, Judge Walker. I really appreciate all of your work with this project and here in the state of Nevada to bring judicial education on juvenile justice to our state. I think it's really an important thing. And as you say, this isn't something that you should have to learn on the job, but I'm really happy that we can be here to provide this service. I'd like to welcome everyone again to our day today. And I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves as well so you get an idea of who we're going to be hearing from. So I'm going to just do a little roll call here. And first, Kelly Vinci Gonzalez. Kelly, are you here?
I'm here. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you for having us. Thank you. And Kelly, can you tell everyone about yourself?
Sure. I am the team chief of the Education Advocacy Program for the Legal Aid Center of Southern Nevada, and we work with kids that have discipline problems in school, have disabilities in school, and other vulnerable populations like foster children to make sure they get everything they need in school to be successful.
I think that school and court partnership is really important to make sure that kids aren't just kind of taking a pathway from school into the justice system, and instead that we're thinking about how to get their educational needs met while also kind of addressing any behavioral issues that they might have. All right, so we also have Catherine Roos with us from the state. Catherine.
Hi, my name is Catherine Roos. I'm the Deputy Administrator of Quality and Oversight at DCFS. And so what that means is I oversee policy, programming, and QA for our state children's services, including juvenile justice, child welfare, and children's mental health.
Great, and thank you so much for being able to join us. I think it's so important to really understand what's happening at that state level and how to access funding, but also what efforts the state is doing to bring programming to Nevada. So appreciate you being here with us. And then my colleague Wendy Schiller from NCJFCJ is here. She's actually filling in for me today, and she is going to serve the role as kind of a bridging research to practice expert. So Wendy.
Hi, thank you, Jessica. Like you said, my name is Wendy Schiller. I work for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and I have done so for 16 years alongside you, and consider myself an expert in juvenile drug treatment courts. But a lot of what I do with juvenile drug treatment courts is what you just said. I sort of translate that research into practice. So what does that research really mean in what they're going to do with those youth and help them be successful?
Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, we are being joined with Judge William Boy from Las Vegas to represent the judicial point of view today. Judge Boy.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me well? Because I'm using my
Yes.
phone because we're having technical difficulties at this end.
Can you tell us a little about
Yeah, I just making sure you can hear well. I've been the juvenile court judge for Clark County, going on 17 years now. And as Judge Walker said earlier, when I took over at the end of 2003, I had a few months to kind of get myself oriented to the job while I was continuing to do my regular calendar. But as far as having any education or it was just trial by fire, essentially. And unfortunately, that seems to be a reoccurring theme that I've witnessed over the last 17 years with judges coming in and rotating in. And it's so important that the judges doing juvenile justice have consistency, education, but more important, staying power. I mean, prior to my taking over down here in Clark County, they rotated the juvenile court judge every 3 years. And so it takes you about 3 years to figure out what the heck you're even doing, let alone rotate out. And so any type of systematic changes that you want to institute as a judge, things that we've done here, things we're going to be talking about during these sessions, only come with time and experience and getting people ownership of what you're doing. And if you're changing judges every 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever it is, your systems have a tendency to stay stagnant and not change. And if you as a judge try to institute change throughout your system, if you're leaving within the next few years, your system's going to wait you out. The systems have a tendency not to want to change, and they change begrudgingly and with lots of pressure and work to get them motivated to change. And if they know some new judge is going to come along in another year or two, or whatever it may be, they'll wait you out and do the passive-aggressive technique they'll do, because the other judge will come in and might want to do something different, right? So it's so important, in my experience, to make sure that we have consistency. But what we're doing here with the Institute is so valuable, because walking into this job, learning on the job is just, even as much education as you can get, you're still gonna learn as you progress. But having the basics down is so important, rather than just being thrown in a baptism of fire. And so these sessions and what will continue, hopefully, will be a great valuable asset to our community here in Nevada, and assist in getting our juvenile justice systems throughout the counties that represent the entire state consistent and moving forward on the cutting edge of what really works for kids and what does not work.
That's perfect. I am so excited about the Institute, because one of the things that we're going to do is that all of this material is going to continue to live on. We're going to have it available to folks on the website, the Nevada Center for Juvenile Justice. And so that means that as new judges are coming in to a juvenile docket, that they will be able to go back and look at all of this material that we've developed and be able to use it, hopefully for years to come. So I'm really excited about this service that we're offering. I'd like to introduce myself to everybody as well. I am Jessica Pierce. I work at the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and it is my great privilege to do that. I am a fourth-generation Nevadan. I was born and raised in Ely and moved to the big city, moved up here to Reno, and so Nevada is near and dear to my heart. I am a Nevadan through and through, and am very, very happy to see us making these strides in judicial education and in how we're approaching juvenile justice in the state. The Juvenile Justice Commission did some amazing work, and we are becoming leaders in this field, and I'm very proud of us for that. It is my privilege to be your educational liaison for the Nevada Juvenile Justice Institute, and so I will be moderating all of our 4 live webinars, and then also we've created all of this, we will have created all of this recorded content that will be available to you, and then also I can serve as a technical assistance liaison to you, answering questions that you might have about how to use our material. You'll notice here in our Adobe Connect system that we have the PowerPoint. You can also see a video of me. All of our other faculty couldn't be on video, so we voted, or what they voted, and I'm the only one on video now. Right underneath that, you can see we have our chat, and then below that, you can see our web links, and this is where those additional resources are. And again, these will also live on the website when we post this webinar to the website. So you'll be able to get to all of these resources. But if you want to check them out now, you can. You just click on one of them, and then you click the Browse To button, and that will actually open up all of these resources in an additional window for you. So that's how you can get to all of those in the Adobe Connect system. As Judge Walker said, you'll have a note-taking guide, which you can use to take notes during the webinar. You can also use it as a resource post-webinar. And then the implementation guide, which I think is really key for making sure that once you leave the webinar, you actually can do things to change how your court operates. So for today, for example, in our implementation guide, one of the things that you'll have available to you is an exercise that you can do with your stakeholders, with your probation folks, to do a mapping of all of your community resources and services to sort of get an idea of what you have available to you, which can help you sort of figure out what you need to develop and target to make sure that the kids in your communities are getting all of the services that they need. And so now with all of that, we're going to get started. And as our panel discussions are going to happen, it's going to be a conversation. So we're going to have some questions that we're going to pose, sometimes to you, sometimes to the faculty, and we'd like to just chat back and forth. You can use the chat box to type your responses. And if you are participating via telephone, you can raise your hand, and I can unmute your phone and you can actually talk out loud. Now, to raise your hand, you're going to look for the icon of a person with their hand raised. It should be somewhere kind of in the top right of your screen, just above the PowerPoint. So if you can look for that, and if everybody just wants to practice right now raising their hands, that's how I would know if you wanted me to unmute your phone. And look at that. Everyone's figured out how to raise their hands. Thank you so much. Okay, perfect. So first, since we are lucky enough to have Catherine Roos joining us from the state, I just wanted to give her a chance to talk a little bit about funding, about how the state's classifying evidence-based programming, and what is available to us from the state level. So Catherine, I'm turning it over to you.
Well, thank you. So Judge Walker did a great job providing an overview of AB 472 and the JJOC. So what I will do is I will move into some statute revisions that were made based on AB 472 that relate to evidence-based practices. So the first is NRS 62B630, and this is the requirement that the state use evidence-based practices in juvenile services. So this relates to the division itself, and it also relates to county juvenile services divisions that receive money from the state. And this includes contracted providers that provide services to juvenile justice departments and counties. So basically it outlines kind of a shaping model where in fiscal year 1920, at least 25% of the services offered must be evidence-based, followed by 50% in fiscal year 2021, 75% in fiscal year 21-22, and then in fiscal year 22 to 23, in each subsequent year, the statute requires that 100% of services offered are evidence-based. So just thinking about some of the programs that we offer at a state level that meet these evidence-based criteria, we use forward thinking in our facilities. We have a facility that uses positive behavioral interventions and supports for behavior management. We use dialectical behavior therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, aggression replacement training, motivational interviewing, and all of these meet the criteria for evidence-based standards. And you can see right now what's pulled up on the screen is the second link in your web link box. This is a matrix developed by the Resource Center to assist facilities and state and county employees in determining whether a program that they're interested in meets the criteria of evidence-based practice pursuant to 62B630. So AB 472, and if you click on the first link in your web links, this will actually take you to another page of kind of a running list of some evidence-based practices being used in juvenile justice in the state. I'll give it a second to load. So you can see some of the models that I mentioned, and this is prompting me to get with the Center for JJ Innovation to make sure that this is updated with some of the newer practices that we've brought into the state. So this is great. So another statute that AB 472 updated was 62B635. So this was the creation of the Resource Center, the Evidence-Based Resource Center, which is the Nevada Center for Juvenile Justice Innovation. So the establishment of this Resource Center was brought around to provide technical assistance to state and county departments of juvenile services around the use of evidence-based practice and ensuring fidelity to the implementation of these practices. and also to act as a clearinghouse for information and resources about evidence-based programs and practices. And so the center has done a lot in terms of developing the matrix and providing information to the counties. Unfortunately, the funding for the Evidence-Based Resource Center has not been able to be maintained at its original funding level. And so we haven't fully realized, the full capacity of such a center in the state, and how important and beneficial that would be for juvenile justice services. So that remains to be something to be looked at in the future. And then NRS 62B620 requires an annual quality assurance review to look at to what level our state facilities are adhering to evidence-based practices. So the state has selected the Evidence-Based Correctional Program Checklist, which is a tool for assessing the programming that occurs in correctional facilities. So the 3 state facilities and the 2 county camps are subject to CPCs. And actually we just found out that the CPC has created community standards. So we are going to be looking into potentially using the CPC for youth parole and maybe the county probation, depending on how the tool is used. So the CPC is completed yearly on the 5 facilities, and it looks at basically capacity to implement evidence-based practices. The results of the CPC are they come in adherence measures, so facilities are in very high adherence, moderate adherence, or low adherence to evidence-based practices. So each facility has been assessed one time, and the baseline scores in these assessments were on the lower side. They were in the moderate or low adherence range. However, being the first time that the facilities were ever assessed with that tool, it was really more of setting a baseline, and now the facilities have had the opportunity to take the results from their first CPC to improve practice over the last year, and the second round of CPCs is starting actually this week. So we hope to see some higher adherence to evidence-based practices in our state facilities this time around. So that was sort of quick and dirty and a lot of NRS citing, and I just hope that provides a little bit of an overview about how, I think one of the greatest things, AB 472 did a lot of great things for the state, and I think, focusing our attention on evidence-based practices and spending money on programs that have been proven to be effective is really important, and I'm glad that it was put into statute, and we hope, as the years go by, that we see the impact of some of these changes towards evidence-based practices. So Jessica, I hope that was what you were hoping for, but I'm more than willing to answer questions or provide additional information.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I did a great job of kind of summarizing things. Now I noticed that right now you're letting people sort of phase into evidence-based practices. And I'm wondering if somebody has a practice or a program that they really like, is there a way to get it added to the list?
So currently, that's a great question. And one of the things I really like, as much as I am a proponent of evidence-based practices, I also love to see innovation, and I love to see, homegrown programs that were kind of created out of necessity and based on the population and the conditions of the population that they serve. But in terms of statutory requirement in 62B630, the programs would have to match that matrix. So it doesn't mean that a facility can't use it. It just means that it can't be paid for with state funding.
Gotcha. That makes good sense. I'm going to turn it to the audience now and see if folks have any questions. You can type them in chat. And for our faculty, if you have a question, you can actually just ask it out loud. So please type your questions for Catherine into chat.
This is Judge Voy. I'd just like to make a comment based upon that question, because when we were framing the bill draft for the legislation originally, you know, that became a hot topic because in order for something to become evidence-based and become then best practices, someone had to think of the idea, or some entity had to think of the idea first, right? And then you roll it out, and then you study it, and then it becomes evidence-based if it's successful, or you know, or you move on to something else, right? There is a lot, as stated before, the prohibition, not prohibition, but the restriction is on the state funding portion of it. So I would never want a judicial officer with this case type to not bring what they think might be a good idea to the table and roll it out as long as you get collaboration and everyone else is in agreement with moving forward with it. Because it took, for something to become evidence-based, someone had to take that chance and come up with the idea in the first place and roll it out. So you don't want to stifle innovation. You don't want to stifle advancement. Because then that will obviously, we will be in a situation 10 years from now where there's no new evidence-based stuff out there because no one had the wherewithal to say, you know, let's give it a shot. The worst case scenario, you know, we'll stop this practice and we'll try something different. In limited doses, of course, but I would just stress that that's so important to keep that in the back of your head as you're moving forward in your juvenile justice, in your jurisdiction, to not forget that innovation is very important, and we don't want to stifle that with just saying, oh, well, we can't do that because it's not evidence-based, no one's tried that before. And that's my only concern with that, and it's something that I think the judges need to be well aware of moving forward in working with their local jurisdictions primarily.
Judge Foy, I'm really glad you brought that up. And if you'll note on the matrix, there is a column that that's called Evidence Informed, and it is in the grouping of columns that are eligible for state funding. And so these would be those homegrown, you know, not on an evidence-based clearinghouse per se, but something that's being done in a jurisdiction that you've been doing for a while. Now, there are some requirements to get it to that evidence-informed level. You know, so basically, if you look at the criteria, there has to be some evidence of effectiveness. You could evaluate it. It doesn't have to be an experimental design. So, for example, you wouldn't have to do like randomized assignment, or you wouldn't need a control group. But you would have to sort of show in some kind of evaluation plan that it is effective for your population in your context. And so I think, you know, when evidence-based standards come into play, I really appreciate this phased-in approach because, for example, we have a couple of years until the requirement that, you know, 100% of practices meet these criteria for state funding. And so we have a couple of years to get some evidence for those practices. And so, you know, if we were implementing something in a state facility that wasn't on a clearinghouse, you know, I might be thinking right now, well, this program appears to really work well for us. So I'm going to put together an evaluation program so that by the time I get to that last year, I have hopefully, you know, compiled enough information to categorize this program as evidence-informed and maintain my state funding. So thanks for bringing that up, Judge Voy, so I could make those additional points. And you know, if counties have questions about particular programs that you're implementing, you're more than welcome to reach out to myself or Leslie Biddleston in the JJ Programs Office, we'll try to help you find a grant to pay for an evaluation team, or we'll see what we can do to help you get some evidence for that program.
I think that's a really great point, Catherine, that the first step should be to reach out to your office to find out about grants, to find out if there's like a partnership with UNR or UNLV to do some of the evaluation that can maybe be done very cheaply. And so especially in a place like Nevada where we have a lot of really rural towns where we probably are doing a lot of homegrown work, how do we make sure that we get to where those can be funded, and also, doing some innovation that can be shared across the country, exporting our great ideas.
Exactly.
All right, and so in the chat, we had a question about whether or not just those evidence-based practices listed in link 1 were the only ones approved, and you've answered no. So there's lots of different evidence-based practices out there that other folks are using in juvenile justice. Do you have, Catherine, any place else folks should look, or should we just be updating the Nevada Center?
Well, I did make a note that Nevada Center needs to be updated, and so I will make a commitment to get some new links added to this website. I mean, I can think of a few right off the top of my head. I even named a few that are being implemented right now in facilities that are not on this page. And so, my previous go-to is always NREP by SAMHSA, but that appears to have been taken down. So, my recommendation is if you identify the need, then, you contact the Center for Juvenile Justice Innovation, or you contact me or my staff, and we will do some research to find an evidence-based program to address that need. So, for example, we're seeing a big spike in, commercially sexually exploited children. What are some good programs for that population? Or we really need LGBTQ, focused programming in our juvenile justice facilities. And then it just becomes sort of a mission of research to find, what has achieved that evidence-based status.
Perfect. And of course, the National Council is here as a resource as well. And so folks that are interested, you can feel free to email us as well to help you find those things. All right. Well, thank you, Catherine, so much. Do we have any other questions for Catherine?
I put my email address in the chat box if anyone wants to reach out with additional questions or guidance on EBPs.
Thank you. I really appreciate you being so willing to put yourself out there and available to our audience today.
Of course, that's my...
It's your job?
Exactly, and I love it.
All right. So for the audience today, I want to ask all of you, let's shift gears a little bit and tell me how you would describe adolescents. So you might be working with them in your court. You might have some that live in your house. You yourself might have been an adolescent at one point. And so what are some of the words that you would use to describe young people in that age range from 12 or 13 all the way up to 18 or 19? Let's get some descriptive words in our chat. And faculty, you can participate in this too. So we've got folks that are saying searching for self-identification, always right, all-knowing. Yeah, those are definitely, you guys live with teenagers, I can tell. Stubborn, confused, impulsive. Absolutely. So when we think about tired, yeah, they, kids don't get enough sleep. They're resistant to getting help, partly because they think they know everything. And so when we think about responding to adolescent behavior, I think it's important to remember how kids are. We can, and sometimes people think about, when we think about adolescent development, that we think that this kind of gives kids an excuse for their behavior or understanding why they do what they do. So like knowing that they behave impulsively can help us understand sometimes why they might get into trouble. And so it does help us understand that. But I think knowing these things actually is much more helpful in thinking about how we actually respond to adolescent behavior. So knowing that kids are searching for self-identification helps us think about when we intervene with kids, we can help them in that search and help them create an identity for themselves that is different from kind of the delinquent, maybe using drugs, maybe getting into trouble, shifting from that kind of view of themselves into a view of themselves as being, part of this community and having things to contribute. And so knowing that they sometimes feel like they're always right, we can use techniques to help them discover what we want them to know without telling them, right? So we help them, we use motivational interviewing them to lead them to the right answer. And so thinking about how kids act and respond helps us figure out how we want to respond to their behaviors. And we know from research that most young people really do grow out of criminal behavior, but we can't really say to the community, hey, don't worry about it. We know they were, that Josh stole a car, but in 5 years he's going to grow out of this and it's going to be fine. We can't do that. So we have to have responses. But as long as we're going to have kids that are involved in the justice system with us, we should think about responses that are going to actually help them grow into those productive adults that we want them to be. So my first question then for our faculty panel goes back to that question. So how are juveniles different from adults? And Wendy, I'm going to kick it to you to be my first respondent to this question from that researchy point of view.
All right, thank you, Jess. I'll try to be very research-oriented. I think it's true. We can say lots of jokes about how juveniles are different from adults and use that as sort of comedy relief, right? But there are many characteristics that really make them different. The risk-taking behavior, they're trying to experiment, sensation-seeking, sort of that appeal of being high, which I use in quotation marks, so maybe not high from a drug, but high from, trying something new that was sort of dangerous. They have underdeveloped critical thinking, here and now thinking, so they don't have an ability to think about what's going to happen 10 years from now, 5 years from now. They're really susceptible to peer pressure, that external peer pressure. Their friends, the people who they're in their age group are way more important to them at this age than probably their parents or authority figures. They have much more heightened emotional responses, so they might fly off the handle more quickly than adults, cry, get sadder, get angrier, and they lack the ability to self-regulate, right? To think about, I have to regulate my behavior here. I have to use my critical thinking skills to calm down, manage my anger, or to not do something, not give into that peer pressure to skip classes or use substances. And right now they're really pulling away and trying to figure out who they are. So they're exerting that disengagement from their parents, from those authority figures at this point in time. The one thing I want to really point out here is that not all of these things that I just mentioned are, big problems. A lot of it is their strengths. Risk-taking behavior, sensation-seeking behavior that ability to take those risks kind of gets us where we need to go. If we don't have that, maybe we'll never get out of our parents' homes. Maybe things that were invented by young people would have never been invented because these are the group of people who take risks, who innovate, who make things happen. They go out and they join the Army and, they fight for our country. They take these great risks, and that is a strength that I think courts can build upon. We have the privilege to be able to work with them and really think about how are the ways we are going to interact with youth to build upon these strengths and help them learn how to self-regulate, right? Help them develop those critical thinking skills, help them think about, okay, how can I control my emotions here? I can't just fly off the handle, whenever I want to. So those are the things that I think are very different from grown-ups, and as much of us can recall, when we were 14, 15, 16, 17, and even up until, age 25, these are the things that we were trying to figure out as we were taking risks to learn more things, as we were experiencing really good feelings about being confident and achieving goals because we were able to take risks, right? So those are the things that I get excited about when I think about the differences between adults and adolescents.
Thank you. I think that was really a great synopsis of sort of what we know about how kids and adults are a little different. And I just want to sort of summarize what you said. So for the audience, I did in fact ask her to say all of those things that would match up with my summary, which is that we know that adolescents make different decisions differently. They're motivated by reward. So when we're thinking about our interventions with kids, we should be thinking about that reward-based intervention and how we can use that peer influence for good rather than for ill, and how we can use their concrete thinking to help them really understand the consequences of their behaviors. So let's use that then as a springboard to talk about how, what are the pathways that kids take into the justice system, which is through the schools. And so we know that kids are referred by the school system or are struggling in school. And so I'm really wanting to have the panel talk about what should courts be doing to address school referrals and also to ensure that the youth educational needs are being met. And I'm going to ask Kelly for you to start us off because you, this is kind of what you do all day, right?
Yes, thank you. And to add to the last point, I also want to add that the normal, typical adolescent behaviors are also further complicated by trauma, fetal alcohol syndrome, autism, cognitive disabilities. And so that can further, complicate adolescent behavior. And a lot of our kids come to the juvenile justice system either diagnosed or undiagnosed with disabilities. And so as judges, take the bench and in their practice, they will start to see kids referred from the school district. I know down south we have a lot of kids that are referred for school-based behavior. It really started back in, if you recall, back to Columbine, and so the response was to start to develop this kind of police presence on campus to keep kids safe, but then it kind of morphed into, well, if kids were showing a typical and somewhat atypical behavior in school, either fighting, theft, disrespect, that they would be suspended or placed out of school discipline. That is very common practice probably for the past 10 years, is that the schools are like, we can't deal with you, sit out of school. Now we all know that leads to delinquent behavior as well. Kids are out of school, they're not being supervised by their parents, and then they get into trouble. So you've seen over the past couple of years sort of this using the juvenile justice system to control school-based behavior. And so now we're sort of, the courts are trying to push back on that and make sure kids that are having issues in school, the school becomes the ground to solve those issues. We just passed restorative justice, which is looking at ways to work with kids that are showing maladaptive behaviors, to work with them to be more successful in school. So you will see that in your practice as you take the bench. As you might know, youth with learning disabilities are more likely to be referred to juvenile justice than their non-disabled peers. One study came out and they said 67% of all kids referred to juvenile justice had an undiagnosed disability that would qualify them for an IEP or a 504, some sort of specialized instruction. So just know that a lot of kids that are going to be referred are coming that have these long-standing diagnoses, that have not been getting help in the schools, have not had the proper supports, and so now it's kind of bubbling over into juvenile justice. Minorities are also overrepresented in that population, so that's just something to look out for. Special education is a federal law. It's codified in NRS 388, and there's two ways to kind of deal with kids with disabilities. One is an IEP, or an individual education plan, and there's 13 recognized disabilities for IEPs, from autism, emotional disabilities, learning disabilities, hearing impaired, visually impaired. So there's 13 different criteria that someone could receive an IEP for. And what an IEP for is, it's like a contract with the school district. The school district says, okay, you need specialized instruction to help you succeed in school. And it can cover a whole spectrum of issues. With an IEP comes goals. So if a child has issues in school, controlling their behavior, maybe with some anger, you can have a goal in your IEP that the school district should be working on that, and have accommodations and supports to try to help the child deal better in school. There's also something called a behavior improvement plan, or a BIP, and that is a whole way that the school knows what a child's trigger behaviors are, how that child calms down, how to react to that child, and so forth. A 504 is a little different. A 504 helps a child up to access the general education curriculum. So if you think about it, a child with diabetes or some other ailment that needs assistance to access the general education curriculum. So there's no change to the curriculum itself like there would be with an IEP. 504s, we're seeing a lot more for kids with trauma. In our area, in Nevada, we have a lot of kids that come to school with trauma, with adverse early childhood experiences. And trauma shapes the brain, it affects the brain, kids react differently, and so there can be support for a child who has those issues in school and help them be successful. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the difference between a 504 and an IEP. I think what I was thinking about when I was thinking about this presentation is, what would I want a judge to ask the families, kids, and stakeholders involved, especially if it's a school-based referral. And some of the questions I thought was, does the child have an IEP or a 504 plan? And if they do, what is it for? What's the eligibility criteria? Is it emotional disturbance? Is it autism? Is it intellectual disability? Is there a BIP? Has the school gotten together and tried to figure out how to support this child in school? If the child does not have an IEP or a 504 plan, I think asking about grades, attendance, discipline history would all be really helpful, because the idea is to help these kids so they don't come back into the system. So if the child's been struggling in these areas, there is help out there. The school district can help the child succeed or do better in school. If there is no IEP, or if there is no 504 in place, I think another good question judges could ask was, has the child ever been referred? Has the child been referred to Child Find? And Child Find is the terminology they use when a child's going through the initial evaluation process. And a parent will often say, yeah, I asked and it never went anywhere. And so really working with probation, if the parent has had repeated frustrations in working with the school district, working with the parent, guardian, you know, and maybe probation could help with making sure that request is in writing, working with the school. The school can also refer the child for evaluation. And then the other question I thought about was what kind of programming. There's a whole continuum of placements and services a child can receive. So a child that has a lot of high needs might go to a special school. The child might go to a comprehensive campus with supports in place, or go to a special class. I think these are all questions that a judge would want to ask to sort of understand and get a fuller picture of what's going on in this child's life, and are there services that could be tweaked or put in place to help that child be more successful in the school setting. So those are kind of, I guess, in a nutshell, the basis of disability in the school and how it does sometimes overflow into juvenile justice.
Well, that was a pretty big nutshell, Kelly. That's, I really appreciate that. So one of the comments that's come into chat, you can see, is talking about that right now one of the big referrals is happening around vape devices and THC vape especially. And so it's overwhelming the school and probably, you know, getting a lot of referrals coming to the system. Have you been working at all to help any of the school districts down in Clark County deal with something like that?
Well, the restorative justice and some of the past legislation has really made very few offenses are mandatory expellable offenses. So we have worked with, we see more of drugs on campus, and so we're seeing a lot more referrals to what we have down here is the Harbor to kind of deal with some of those issues of vaping pens or paraphernalia, and then, you know, maybe marijuana or some of the other substances that are found on them. So we see a lot of diversion through the Harbor coming in to and they're working that way. That's mainly what I've seen with the drug-related offenses is that, you know, the big ones we see, honestly, are battery, assault, you know, destruction of property, and so forth and so on.
That makes sense. Judge Boyd, did you want to weigh in a little bit here on how you feel like judges should be addressing this partnership with the schools?
Yes, I would. Let me take a step back in the bigger picture. You know, when we started down here in Clark County, beginning in 2004, one of many things we tried to do and have been working on ever since is that pipeline from the school to, you know, prison pipeline. You know, it's something that's been around for decades, obviously, and it's something that's not an easy, quick fix either. It takes institutional change. And institutional change is not in your juvenile justice system per se, even though that's very important. The biggest challenge you're going to have, the biggest pushback you're going to have are the schools and those folks and everyone else that's involved in running and establishing the protocols in place in your schools. Because when we first started, we just pushed back. You know, we just said, no, we're not accepting these citations. You know, you guys deal with it. This is school-based behavior. This is not quote-unquote criminal type behavior. This is stuff that needs to be dealt with within the school and not sent to us, because we all know, and it's all been proven, that once kids, especially kids of disproportionality, come to the juvenile justice system, they have a tendency to escalate within our system. And so it's also been proven if you keep them away from our system, they're going to stand a much better chance of making a successful transition into adulthood and out of our juvenile justice system. So developing, though, the framework to cause that to happen so that you're not just pushing back and saying you just deal with it, that was the spark that generated over 3 years ago now our School of Justice Partnership. Restorative justice, there's all kinds of different names, but essentially that is the it's like going back to the future in a nutshell. It's basically, because a lot of people struggle with this concept. Before we had, you know, officers in schools, for example, the discipline or the consequences or the intervention would occur at the school level and stay at the school level. And what we use in down here is the concept of we in the juvenile justice system do not want to see that kid that pisses you off. We want to see the kid that scares you. The ones that are just annoying, you know, and are school disturbances. I mean, there's a big push to get rid of the school disturbance charge altogether, and some of those mandatory expulsions, because that, you know, it's been proven that keeping kids engaged in school, we're going to have much better graduation rates, more likely not to come to the juvenile justice system and other related type of offenses outside of the school systems, and be more successful, and also ultimately school safety is benefited by it. And so building that framework, as was mentioned earlier, but the harbor, we came up with the harbor idea, the juvenile assessment drop-in center, as a way to divert kids immediately into resources, because the juvenile justice system is not something that happens overnight. So when you get a referral citation into the juvenile justice system from the school, that child may not even see a judge. That child may be first diverted to a probation officer 4 to 5 weeks after the event occurred in school. And the kid's since been put back in school, but there's been no intervention. And so the schools have this concept that they're relying upon the juvenile justice system to intervene in whatever the issue was. And the school is more in a much better position to effectuate change, bring in resources, address the issue that caused the kid to come to the attention of those in the school to begin with, if you keep that child engaged there. So, but you've got to build the resources and the culture within the schools that instead of escalating the school-based behavior, like the perfect example, the kid that refuses to take off his hat, right? And then it escalates, and they call school police, and the next thing you know, you got an obstruction charge, and then you got a resisting arrest charge, all because the kid wouldn't take his hat off, and the teacher couldn't figure out, didn't know what else to do other than to escalate the system, the situation. And so what we've been doing down here in Clark, and what a lot of jurisdictions have been doing, is working with those jurisdictions. And again, the agent for change is the court, is that judge, is the juvenile justice community that is there to help support and educate the schools on what practices can be employed to de-escalate, for example, that behavior, or to address that behavior and not just refer it to the juvenile justice system thinking that that system is going to take care of it. And quite frankly, we're not in the best position to do that. And so that was the genesis behind the School Justice Partnership in Clark County. And up until the virus put a stop to us here, we were making great inroads in full implementation of that program for this school year that was supposed to start this week. So it takes a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of cajoling and politicking within the powers that be that control your school district and dictate how that's going to happen, whether it's your school boards or your superintendents or whatever. They all have to be on board. And that takes a Herculean effort sometimes to get that to happen. And then you have to have the resources out there like the juvenile assessment centers, the harbors, to divert those kids away from us to those centers. And that takes a lot of time, energy, and commitment. We've been able to accomplish that here in Clark County. We had 3 running at once, and now we're down to 1 at the moment. But we envisioned at least having 5 here in Clark County to take care of the population down here, to give real resources to those in the front lines, the teachers and administrators and the bus drivers, everyone that works in the schools, the education and resources to keep those kids at school, but addressing those behaviors at the same time. And that's really where we as a community and also throughout the United States need to go with this. And a lot of the more forward-thinking jurisdictions have made great strides in that area, and there's a lot more to come. And so that would be my 2 cents worth on that particular topic.
Well, I really appreciate your 2 cents. One of the things that really strikes me is that you guys really do have this kind of partnership with the schools, and you're really focusing on how everyone can work together to get the best outcomes for kids. And so it's, and you started kind of the blame of, we don't want it, this is your problem, don't give it to us. And that obviously didn't work. And so that idea that there has to be some collaboration, I think, is really key.
Oh, that's the key to everything we're talking about today, but the next sessions this week. The collaboration is the fundamental framework of a real good juvenile justice system, which includes one of your major partners is your school district, obviously, and you've got to be hand in hand with that school district, and otherwise you're not going to be successful. And that takes, like I said, it takes a lot of hard work, energy, and whatnot to make it happen. And so hopefully we're going to down here in Clark to get some revigoration of that come hopefully next year. We'll see how this progresses over the next few months, but moving forward, that's the way we're going to be successful as a community, in this community or any other community throughout the United States.
And I do think when I'm thinking about our more rural parts of the state, that in some ways that this collaboration can be easier in our smaller judicial districts, because it's more likely that that all of the folks that are parts of these systems know each other, and will have maybe fewer silos to break down in that collaboration. And so I think this is the kind of thing that can be done regardless of whether or not you're a big jurisdiction like Vegas or one of the smaller ones like the folks over in Humboldt County and Winnemucca. So I appreciate that.
No, and it's so true. It's so true what you say, and because if you look at Clark County, it's a good example. Is that we just have pockets of small communities, rural communities within the county,
right.
And they struggle. They say, well, that works great in town, but not out in Mesquite, for example, or down in Laughlin, for example. We just can't drive, 60 miles into town or 50 miles into town to do this, right?
Right.
And so that's really it's so much easier to do in that regard, because those are, like you said, so much easier to attack and identify and deal with, rather than now the fourth largest school district in the country. So yes, right. Very much so.
They can't have a place like the Harbor necessarily, but they have other strengths that they can build on instead.
Exactly. And the judge's role is to go out and actually help develop that and help to recruit that in those smaller communities. In fact, we were planning to do that April 2nd. We're sending a crew out, myself, to Mesquite, Nevada to do that. And of course, the virus put a stop to that for now. But yes, you can easily do that. Yep.
Wonderful. All right, let's get into the meat of things a little bit here, and talk about an adolescent-friendly environment in the court, and what that kind of can mean. We spend a lot of time at the National Council thinking about how our court users experience coming to court, and I think especially for young people, if we remember how they react to things, what that court experience might feel like from their point of view, and how we can make it a little bit more inviting. Wendy, why don't you talk, and then we'll hear from Judge Boy.
Sure. I think the best context here is, or the thing that I'd like to get across for judges, is that the process doesn't have to be part of the punishment. So that it's okay for youth to come in and to have a respectful conversation that doesn't include a lot of lecture. And since we know from the previous discussion from Kelly and the key points that you brought up, Jessica, thinking about how youth or adolescents are more motivated by rewards than sort of that punishment or that lecture. And that's kind of a difference there in between how do adults act and how do adolescents act. An adult might be more motivated by a deterrent. So observing something else happening to a kid that is bad, or an adult that is bad, we'd be like, oh, I don't want that to happen to me. But kids are more motivated by that reward, as you pointed out. And so one of the things that I've seen a lot of courts do, and this works really well in a juvenile drug treatment court environment, is that they set up a process for how they are going to talk to youth about really specific individualized goals that they're working on, So how are they learning those skills that are going to make them be a better critical, put on their critical thinking hats, correct? And how are they going to learn to be good citizens of the communities that they're living in? How are they going to be more connected to their schools and work inside, knowing that they might have an IEP or some of the other challenges that Kelly was bringing up? The way that we can do this is become very individualized. How can we talk with them specifically about the goals that they're working on, and how does that help them be connected more to their families and more to their communities?
All right, and Judge Boyd, can you tell us a little bit about what you do in your courtroom to make sure that kids understand what's happening, that they are able to leave knowing what they're supposed to do next, and that you make sure that you mitigate as much as you can some of that trauma that can happen at the court?
Okay, it's a big topic. And I'll start with a comment that in this, not just for judges, but everyone involved in juvenile justice, as they say, programs don't change kids. Relationships do. And we all know you can have a good program, but if your staff stinks, you ain't going to be successful, right? You can have a marginal program, but if your staff is incredible, as far as being able to talk and reach a child, they're going to be successful, regardless of your programming itself is, let's say, marginal, right? And the judge in the courtroom, it's the same thing. Kids tell me this, both in court, but also years later when I run into them, is that you need to convey to them that, and another thing I usually say is this: I try to talk with a kid and not at a kid, because we have a tendency as adults to talk to kids, right? We talk to other adults that way too, but that's a whole other issue. But we have a tendency to talk at kids and tell them this is what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and that's just the way it is. Well, you need to, again, it goes down to that dialogue you have and being able to connect with that child in the courtroom. And that goes, and you can talk about the smaller things like making sure you're explaining things and explaining to them why you're doing what you're doing. For example, your kid says, you're sending a kid, let's say I send a child to Spring Mountain Youth Camp, for example, right, which is our county camp here in Clark County. And they said, sometimes the parents will even say this, and they'll say, well, I got to do my time, I got to do my punishment. And you have to stop them right there and say, no, this is not, you're not going up there to punish you. You're going there because I want you to learn this, and that. We're going there to, and offer some information, insight as to what's available to them based upon the programming that you're sending them to, right? To try to get a little bit of a buy-in so they understand that I'm not just sending you there to do time. That's not what we're doing here. We're here because you're going to go up there, we're going to get some vocational training, your education needs to get back on track. We're going to work on these issues, and we're going to work about how you're going to respond better and make better decisions on events that occur in your life moving forward to get you ready for that next change, which is that adulthood we're talking about. It's going to hit you right in the face if you're not ready for it. And so building that relationship with is so important. You can do it in the court process without losing the process of litigated adversarial process to some degree. But even my DAs take that position too in court. My district attorneys, they'll take that position. They're advocating to send the kid to, let's say, the Spring Mountain Youth Camp, for example. They'll say why, though. Not to just punish you, but because we think you need this kind of mentoring, this, kind of support, for example. And if you do that in context of every kind of disposition you have, using just the placing the kid in the camp at the higher end of things, but every time you're interacting with that kid and developing that relationship rapport is so important. You can do it so easily if you just take your ego aside and remember they're kids. Remember that we're raising, and unfortunately to some extent we're raising kids in the court process and in what we do in the juvenile justice world, and you treat them accordingly. And so, to me, that's one of the most important ways to do that. I mean, when the kid tells you, to go take a flying leap because you just ordered them placed at the camp, for example, you don't get your dander up and get all upset. You need to check your ego and say, "Have a nice day, son. I'll see you later." And I guarantee you, when it's happened to me, overwhelming majority of the time, I'll see that kid again. They'll apologize to me before they'll say anything, before their lawyer gives them a chance, will say anything. They say, Judge, I need to apologize for last week when I was in your courtroom. I'm really sorry, I was upset. Whoa, that's huge. Now you've broken those barriers down. And making that the kid the focal point of things. I had a young, and I need to share this story, so give me 2 seconds with this one. I had a young girl in court. She was on probation. She was a dual ward. She was on the Department of Family Services side in the foster care system. And she was time to terminate probation. So she was in court with her lawyer. And we were talking about terminating. And she's just sitting there listening. And she raised her hand and I have a question. And the lawyer reached over to listen to her. The lawyer goes, "My client wants to know whether or not if we terminate probation, whether you'll still be her judge or not." And I said, "Well, no, if we terminate probation, I won't be your judge anymore." She goes, "I don't want to be terminated from probation." And I took a step back and think to myself, I had to ask her, of course. I said, "Why? You earned being off of probation." She goes, "The reason why, when I come into your courtroom, it's all about me. When I go to that other courtroom on the foster care side, it's about my parent, my mother or whoever, right? But in your courtroom, it's about me." And that hit me like a rock hit me between the eyes. I'm like going, whoa! From a 12-year-old kid, that's the crucial part of it. So that's my force. I'm work up to 4 cents now.
I really like that idea that putting the youth in the center and not in a negative, here's all the things you did wrong, but instead in that you are a person who has strengths and resources and you are a rational actor in your own life. So how can we promote that? I thought that was a really smart point. I really like how you have to be the adult in those interactions with kids, because we know from adolescent development they're going to come back at you, and you can't be reactive to that.
And judges need to understand that, and I use this all the time in the courtroom, because I have a 9-year-old son in my advanced age. But anyway, one of my philosophies is that I will not place a kid in a place or put them in a program I wouldn't put my own son in. And that's just not fluff. That's reality. And if you believe it and you say it with that belief, the kids pick up on that. They know when BS is coming out. These kids, a lot of kids we deal with, they may have issues, but they definitely they can tell when they're talking with an adult or an adult talking with them, whether that adult really cares or not. They can pick up so fast. And you've got to project that as the judge in that courtroom.
Absolutely. Well, I think this was a great master class in how to be a juvenile court judge. From your point of view, Kelly, can you just chime in with anything that we should be thinking about to make sure that for those kids that do have like learning disabilities, that we're thinking about those kids as well when they come into court?
Sure. I think just making sure that they really understand what you're saying, because we have kids all the time that say yes, 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 and they have no idea what you're talking about. So, you know, the nice thing about JJ is that they do have a lot of good assessments. So to make sure that you're communicating with the child, you know, at a level they can understand and in plain language, I think is the most important thing you can do. And to really make sure, I think explaining things back is a great way to make sure that the child actually comprehends what you're talking about. And just really, like Judge Boyce said, it's all about that connection and that relationship with that child, which I know is hard to do because there's the calendars are loaded, but I think the kids really do appreciate that, and really giving them the space to ask questions, to get their questions answered, to feel empowered, and to feel like they can make change for the good are all really, really important in that setting when I've worked with youth.
Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, I think we have to remember that kids aren't going to change because we want them to change. They'll change because they want to change, and our job is to help be that change agent for them. So I really appreciate the idea that we're going to be thinking about how we can make that as easy as possible for them when they join us in court. So our key points here, we're going to use material that are written in plain language. We're going to provide youth with reminders. So if you have, you know, youth are supposed to be coming back to court for appointments, just like how we need reminders when we all go to the dentist, kids are going to need reminders about their appointments too. And sometimes they're coming from a pretty chaotic life, and so those extra services we can offer are important to making sure that we help them achieve their goals. And then this last one is one that I think we touched on already, that when youth have a negative reaction in court, it's okay to give them a moment to gather themselves, and that you should not react from a punitive place. This is a typical adolescent reaction, and so some talking back and some disrespect is baked in. So don't let it rile you. All right, so finally, I just want to circle back around to the idea of characteristics of programs that work for kids. And so we're going to we talked a lot with Catherine about evidence-based programs, and now we're going to talk more broadly about what those characteristics look like. And there's been, in the last 20 years or so, quite a bit of research actually done around what characteristics of programs for kids look like. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there was less. We didn't necessarily know for sure what worked, so we tried lots of different things. But now we actually do know quite a bit about what works, and so we can use these strategies. Wendy, why don't you talk a little bit about characteristics of programs that work for juvenile offenders?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. I think what's really exciting is that we're in this place and in time that we actually do really know what works with juvenile justice, with youth who are coming into juvenile justice. And that's evidenced by the first part of this session, right? So talking about that list and the EBPs, and also keeping that in mind with how do we still be innovative, thinking about how are we going to target programs to the youth specifically in our communities, right? So first off, when we think about what really works with youth in juvenile justice, that we need to match the interventions and programming to the criminogenic needs that are identified in the risk need assessments. And in Nevada, we're using the YLS, right? So we need to be as judges, kind of very comfortable. What are those domains in there that are dynamic, that can help us understand what interventions and programming should be matched to that moderate to high risk, right? And lots of those effective programs, they focus on restorative justice practices, restitution, victim offender mediation, really focused on skill building. So when you're thinking about programming and intervention with kids, you're not only just did they go, you're asking, what did you learn? What did you learn there? What are the skills that you're learning? Counseling, individual, group, family, mentoring, Those things we know from the research work well with kids. Really important takeaway from the research that Mark Lipsey did in, that we can find in his big report from 2010, coordinated case planning. So case planning and management, where probation officers, case managers, people who are service providers working with youth are thinking about what are all the interventions, programming that I'm going to do with this kid based on this risk need assessment. How am I going to coordinate that across the service delivery? Make sure not only that they're attending, but also that they are learning skills there, and that those skills are completely, they can drive back to that risk assessment, because what we're really looking at is how we reducing that risk to reoffend, and we do that through some really good case planning, programming, and building those skills for kids.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, that like the case planning and coordinated service delivery is really important. And I think judges play such an important role in the leadership of making sure that that happens. So Judge Boy, I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about how you're making sure that what's happening kind of in all of your service providers is kind of in line with these key principles, and how the judge's role works there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everything was just said. And seeing it and having it actually happen are two different things, unfortunately. And we all know what the goal is. It's getting there. And unfortunately, just like, human nature is what we have. I mean, you have good people and you have people that just dial it in, as they say, right? It's just a job. I think one of the most important things you as a juvenile court judge is to advocate, obviously, for that coordination that needs to happen, and everything else that needs to be done in that regard. But more importantly, it starts with the hiring process, quite frankly, in my opinion, what I've seen over the years. It starts when you've hired new recruits that are going to be probation officers, and you put them through your academy, and you start teaching these principles to them and getting them, the old guard's hard to, old dogs can't learn new tricks, but you get them young before they learn bad habits, and you train them properly, and you're going to be effective. And we're starting the fruit is starting to come out of the tree now, finally, after many, many years of institutionalizing those concepts into our training academy and our constant training. And it is the judge is the one that needs to be that leader, saying this is what we're doing, and this is how we're doing it. And if you came into this business because you couldn't get hired as a regular police officer, right? Then maybe you should go in a different business, because we're here, we're in the business of trying to fix kids and help families, and obviously public safety is extremely important to that process, of course, the side of that. But you've got to have those folks around you that are committed to working with these families, working with these kids, and that's so crucial. And again, the judge is the leader of that and needs to mandate it. The other way of doing it too, which is again time-consuming, very difficult, and it's hard to let go to some degree, is a lot of status checks until you assure that program that you're referring to the kid is actually working. They're doing what they say they can do, rather than you read a nice brochure on what this program will do, but in reality, does it actually do it? And you have quality assurance, and you have to have vetting processes in place to make sure that all those folks, mentoring groups, whatever you're talking about, mentoring to mental health, that they are actually doing what they say they can do, and there's coordinated effort between that and the probation officer, who is more like a case manager when you're talking about this particular subject at this point in time, and that those other entities and other folks work well and coordinate together. It's so important, and you've got to do it from the top down, and you got to bring it from the bottom up as you're training new people coming on board.
I really like what you said about getting new probation officers and getting them kind of young. But what it really struck me as is this idea that there's an entire culture and philosophy around juvenile justice that is different than the rest of the justice system. And I think we're seeing some shifts in criminal justice altogether that make it look more like the juvenile justice system. Mm-hmm. But the idea that the juvenile justice system exists for a different purpose and that we have a different philosophy is really important for everyone who works within the system and who's working with these young people to understand. And I think that culture does really come from the judge, but also within the entire system. You're right that there are so many folks that need to just remember that their job is different than being a police officer or being an adult probation officer. And so thinking about the philosophical shifts that must occur for that. I really appreciated that comment. I thought that was great. The key points here that you heard Judge Boy earlier talking about kind of doing a restorative justice model for their approach to working with the school district. Restorative justice practices are really important within the justice system, and we know they work really well with kids. We know it helps them make those connections back to their communities. Those skill building things, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is one of the evidence-based treatments that's available in the state of Nevada. You heard Catherine mention that. Helping kids learn how to think, because we know the brain doesn't fully develop, and kids don't have critical thinking skills right off the bat, and even some adults aren't terribly good at critical thinking. So how can we help make sure they have good critical thinking skills? Getting them connected to positive social outlets is really important. We know that those better different peer groups and mentors can help kids change their lives. Having good counseling services. And then, of course, again, as Wendy mentioned, the multiple coordinated services. We are right at the end of our time, and so I am just going to ask everybody from my panel to have their final thoughts. And so I'm going to ask first for Kelly to share your final thoughts with us today.
I guess my final thought would be that, being an optimist that I am, that change really can happen. I know through the kids we have through juvenile justice, when you put the right supports in place for school and in the community, kids can really turn around and do things that a lot of folks maybe thought weren't possible. I had one child who was facing their second expulsion from school, and we got him the right services in school, and he actually graduated. So I think always looking at that end game of success for these kiddos and that it can happen, that would be my parting words.
Wonderful. I really like that we don't know who's going to be successful, and so we shouldn't make any assumptions. I like that. Wendy, what's your final thought?
Yeah, I would just echo that. It's so important to see the strengths in the adolescents we're working with. They're not defined by how they're in trouble, what brought them to the court system. So I really agree with that. And then I'll make two final thoughts. Jess, you know how I always break the rules. As judges, you have to hold the folks who are coming in front of you accountable for this. So if you want to make sure the youth are learning skills, have really good coordinated case management and case planning that is driven by risk need assessments, you have to hold those court actors accountable to that. So you have to ask for that. So you have to rely on this process that we know works with kids, and make sure that all your probation officers, the counselors who are involved in the system, your defense attorneys, prosecutors are speaking the same language as well.
Great final thought, Wendy. Well, final two thoughts. And Judge Boy, I was saving the last word for you.
Okay. My last word is to the judges or potential judges or future judges. Remember, the juvenile court was the first specialty court in the world. I mean, in the turn of the century, and not 2000, but 1900. It was the first specialty court. If you look at it, it is a specialty court. And that means that, and what's so unique about the juvenile court system is, in fact, whatever everyone just said, I totally agree with, by the way. But my point being is that you can actually see change. And it's so rare that you get that opportunity as a judge to actually have a hand in seeing that change happen. And it can happen before your very eyes. And the first time a kid comes back to you, they're no longer a kid, just comes back to your courtroom to say thank you. And they made it, and they graduated from college, which has happened to me on numerous occasions. That's what makes this job so incredible, to see that. Are there failures? Yes, there's failures. If we only could predict what the 8%, they always have the 8% rule, they call it in the juvenile justice world. The 8% of the kids that we touch, they're going to end up in the adult system, no matter what we try and do. And that's a rule that's been out there for years. The question is being able to identify that 8% ahead of time, which obviously is impossible. But we try our best to attempt that. But to watch that change occur, that's the most amazing part of it. And if you want that out of your profession, this is the right job for you.
What a great note to end on. All right, I'd like to thank our entire panel for their work today. And I'd like to thank all of you in the audience today. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about judicial leadership and ethics. So we're going to keep digging into these ideas. And so we will see you all tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.